Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, the race to the starting line, a look at the Accessible Canada Act. Max Brault is the author. He joins me on the program. Welcome to the show, Max.
Well, thank you for having me.
So obviously this isn't just an academic exercise for you. This is a lifelong journey and a deeply personal one, this issue.
Yes, it is.
You start... Sorry, I was going to say, you started in the introduction talking about how the charter, when it was introduced, your father kind of turned to you and said, like, this is the beginning for you.
Yes. Yeah, it was a very my parents. I grew up in a very political family, and my family was very happy to see the Charter of Rights come to being. But they knew there was flaws, and I had some issues with it when I was a kid because at first they didn't mention Indigenous folks and people with disabilities. It came after. It came way before they signed it, but it was still an afterthought. And so I always got a little bit miffed when I was a kid that my community was an afterthought, and that's when I started waking up to the reality of having a disability.
You mentioned that your family was political even before that. Did this kind of like crystallize that politicization?
Well, for me, it did. For my folks, it was a lot of hard work. My parents were francophones, and they were fighting in the Quebec side a lot for French rights. But my father always believed himself that being French was also Canadian. So he never belonged to the Quebecois kind of philosophy. He always belonged to the French Canadian philosophy that he was Canadian first, French second.
So more of the patchwork quilt vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because that does raise the question, like sort of like intersectionality, right? And that like being French Canadian, being having someone with a disability, that like you're a multiplicity of things, and how your rights are impacted by those, that patchwork quilt is something that I think kind of not everyone reckons with.
Yeah, but in my case, it was a little bit more unique because of my disability. They were afraid that my education, going through the educational system, was going to be somewhat challenged. I was a very sickly kid. So they decided, and I say they, my parents decided that it would be best that I would learn English first, and that they would do their best to teach me French. And so I went through the English system. I have a sister who went the opposite. She went through the bilingual system and became more bilingual quicker than I did. Because, well, I love my parents very much, but they didn't spend a lot of time teaching me French. So it was a really, really awkward situation where, they were, a family of four, and my parents talked French all the time. Like if you were to come out into my house when I was a teenager, you would never hear a lick of English, except coming from me. Because every time my parents would talk to me, I would respond in English, and I got away with it.
That's an interesting approach to a family conversation dynamic. Did that kind of outsider status within your own family like steal you for some points of your life where that you would find yourself at a table where you're the outsider in ways that you're and then you have to kind of push for your own rights?
Yeah, I did. My both my mother's side and my father's side of the family, my more on my father's side was more insulted in the fact that I wasn't speaking French. My mother's side of the family was more European and descendants, so to them it was kind of common for everybody to kind of come to the table with a different language anyways. But they were still, putting a lot of pressure on my parents to make sure that I learned French, and I never did in the normal system. I eventually went to learn French for 2 years, and I would think my French is okay, but it's not really good.
Sure enough. Now, we mentioned that obviously the charter and your orientation around disability advocacy and rights kind of starts then. But when does this book start? I'm curious about kind of like when the journey of going from advocating and working in this field to then writing about this field starts for you.
Well, the thing is that I I I ended up being in the federal public service for 21 years. And when I first started in the service, I was designated to help get more individuals with disabilities into the federal public service. So I would make sure I would go out to the communities and make sure that they understood that they could apply for government jobs, how to apply, trying to make it easier for them to get into the federal public service. I would also became an expert on how to accommodate their needs. So if somebody came in and only had a right hand, only had a left hand, I would make sure they would have a left hand keyboard. So I did a lot of that internally. But when I joined the federal public service, there was a really interesting movement that started, and it began with the at that time the visible minorities, and basically at that time that's what we called them, but now they're called the racial community. The racial community started organizing themselves and started realizing that if they didn't have a voice at the management table internally, that their particular issues and rights would never be heard. So I jumped on that bandwagon and I started working with them to understand how they did things, and then started organizing people with disabilities internally. Because I thought if the racialized community was going to have a voice, why not people with disabilities? So I was one of the first organizers internally, believe it or not, getting individuals with disabilities to start becoming part of a collective. And so, but I still did my day job, which was I was an HR specialist, which is basically what they call a PE category. So I was doing my HR job on top of doing this on the corner of my desk.
It's interesting to hear you went from like individual accommodation, like a left-handed keyboard for someone, to identifying that like there needed to be like group advocacy and lobbying efforts, because that's one of the things you highlight in Supreme Court challenges to charter rights, that in very often cases the settlements or the decisions were individualized, right? That it was like specific to that person who lodged the complaint and took it, rather than seeing a sweeping change coming out of that.
Yeah, and it always kind of, to be straightforward with you, I never understood that, right? Because most of the battles right at the beginning were for individuals who were either deaf or who were blind. And most of the decisions that were in the favor of that individual would benefit the community as a whole. And again, the government didn't do a lot at the start. Like I'll give you an example with the one with the blind, where the government turned around and said, okay, what we learned from this is we're going to make sure all of our exterior websites are going to be fully accessible. Okay, but what about all the tools and all the internal government stuff that people use? Well, they neglected that part. It took until the ACA, the Accessible Canada Act, before they turned around and said, oh, shoot, we got to do this stuff now.
That they're seeing the like consumer side rather than the participant side?
That's right. Like, so as an employee, so if you were an employee who was blind, it would be really hard pressed for you to get all of the tools you needed on the internet, internal internet government stuff. Like we have, like you got to remember, every large organization has some kind of internal tools and systems, right? Those weren't accessibilized. It was only the stuff that was pointed outwards.
And obviously, for the people to do their job, they need those tools for accessibility within the context of their job. So the internal.
Yeah. So there was a lot of problems internally, Michael.
So, I mean, is this like an awareness shift, or like, how do you view, like, for organizations to understand kind of what accessibility is it like, a like complete mind shift to think like 360 in some sense, right? Like that, if you're only looking outward, you're not looking at the people that are generating things within your organization. Like, is that kind of the crux of things, or do you think there's like a deeper issue?
I think there's a deeper issue. The deeper issue is really what it comes down is money, right? So the problem is all of a sudden the government has been told you got to make everything exterior or work for people with disabilities, and they only have $5. And I'm using this as just a metaphor.
Sure.
So you use the $5, you don't have anything left over to do something internal. And so what happens is that you have nothing to do internal. And you go, well, we did our mandate. We made sure that the public outside that uses our services are fully accommodated, and we will deal with our employees as an issue arises.
So this,
And that never, and that lasted for almost 20 years.
and that's obviously some of the period in which you cover the journey towards the Accessible Canada Act in this book and your work. So at what point do you start writing this book? Like, what crystallizes in you that this journey, this issue is something that merits this book?
Well, this is, I mentioned this a little bit in the book. I had a few beers with Minister Cultural at the time, and we were talking about we were celebrating the fact that the act itself was written. It was known as Bill C-81 at the time, but everything was in place. So all we needed was for it to be as a docket for the Governor General at the time to basically turn it into a law. And typically things can sit on a shelf for anywhere for a month to 6 months before it gets to the Governor General. Usually has like 2 sessions a year where they go through all the bills and turn them into law. And all it is a nod of her head. So, and I said to her that it was a really big shame, because the number one thing that people don't understand that don't work for the federal government, or even if you work for the federal government but you don't design legislation, is legislation doesn't just happen overnight. It's a very, very long, complicated process. And for some cases, it takes maybe a decade or two. We were given 4.5 years to create a piece of law and get buy-in from all the government departments and buy-ins from all the corporations and the public in 4.5 years. That was a monumental, massive amount of work. And I said to her that it's too bad that we don't record and we don't talk to people about how we did this, why we did this, the individual stakes that we did this. So about 2-3 days later, well, not her, one of her staff emailed me and said, "Hey, Max, you got $40,000 to record everybody's perspective on their work on the act." So I went out and I hired a buddy of mine who just finished working on the X-Files. You remember the X-Files?
I do.
And I said, "Look, Dean, I have no clue how to do this. Do you know how to do this?" He says, "Look, if you give me X amount of money out of that 40, I'll hire a team. I'll have everybody ready. Just give me a date where we can interview everybody." And we did that. And I was going to turn that material into an actual visual documentary. But then COVID hit, and it kind of took the thunder and the money out of a lot of things. After COVID, I couldn't get anything going. So my daughter one day came up to me because she thought I was really frustrated. And she's like, "Why don't you turn this into a book? You control everything. You don't need sponsorship." And I haven't looked back. So it took me about 4 or 5 years to make this happen.
So did you have any rough material for the documentary, or was that kind of something that got cut short or stopped in its infancy? And I'm curious because I'm always interested in process, so I'm very interested to know, like, if you had material and then like shifted to the book, what translated, but what was that process?
No, but that was really interesting, and that's a really good question, Mike. I thought right? That my daughter's idea was brilliant at the time. So, but I had 9.5 hours of footage. And you know that 9.5 hours, is not going to turn into a documentary of 9.5 hours. You could turn that into maybe an hour's worth of stuff, right?
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, I'll take the 9 hours, run it through some kind of um, computer system, and this is what I was thinking, that could turn it all into text. So what I did is I found a computer program. I ran the 9.5 hours through this program, and it gave me, pages and pages of text. But the problem was, Michael, the text did translate very well into a book
Mm.
because it was a lot like, interviewer asking, so what did you do? Well, I did this and this and this. And going to the next person and said, hey, what did you do? Why did you do it this way? It just didn't turn too well into an actual book. So I had to sit down and I'm not saying there wasn't some stuff, but I took a lot of the stuff that could turn into a book and started figuring out what would the book look like. And that's where, pretty much what I designed is what the book looks like today. Um, I just couldn't go and tell people about the disability movement without explaining why it exists and the key elements of the disability movement. And then I had to talk about something called the Lego sessions. And then I went through all the 7 pillars and that's how I designed it. I might have had one or two extra chapters that I kind of melded into one, but what you see is pretty much what I figured out a few years ago.
Right. Even as a documentary, you would have needed an editor to like piece together kind of a narrative from all those interviews and those hours of footage. Like you said, it would be 9 hours condensed to maybe an hour. You then had to act as your own editor and director. It sounds like, to kind of piece together what you could use from that text and give shape to this story.
That's right.
You mentioned the Lego sessions. I do want to ask, like, if you can elaborate on the role Lego played in the Accessible Canada Act.
Well, can I give a little bit of pretext where it came from?
Absolutely, yes.
So where it came from, the one of the things that will happen with the new Trudeau administration is he wanted everybody to go out there and engage various communities to get their input in whatever kind of policy direction that people were working on. So we had spent about a year, and I say we as a chunk of people from Minister of Cultural Shop went around the country asking a lot of people with disabilities, a lot of high-ranking um, organizations, what would this act look like? The problem is that a lot of them were decimated during the 9 years of the conservative government beforehand. So when they had an opportunity to speak to the government, they weren't coming to the government to help them write a piece of legislation. They were running to the government to explain to them, saying, we need to exist. You need to give us funding. It was a very much an angry sessions with a lot of these organizations. So Minister Cultural was talking to my boss and myself in a meeting one day. And we asked her, said, how you come along with the material? She's like, got nothing. I got nothing. And so my boss, whose name was Yasmin, looked at me and said, do you think we could come up with something? And I said, if you give me 2 days, I'll come up with an idea and then I'll come back to you, the both of you, with an idea. And so the idea was, we have internally within the federal public so a lot of people with disabilities working in all angles, all levels, you name it, we're there, right? And so I thought, why don't we bring in these folks into a few day session and ask them about some key things that we should, as the government, develop in a piece of legislation. So when I went back to them, they agreed to this. They gave me a budget. Then I proceeded to put this into place. And I couldn't do the consulting work on it. I needed to hire somebody to do it. And a good friend of mine was running basically a kind of like an internal think tank within the government, and said, "Well, I will find your consultant." And so she went and found a consultant for me, and these folks specialize in using Legos. At first, all I cared about was I need something innovative, thought provoking that would get people working and getting me the results. I never really thought about the Legos. So as I say in the book, when I finally came to me that all we were going to do for 3 days was play with Legos, I was really scared, Michael. I thought I was going to lose my job, right? Um, and but Legos are magic. I've never been in a session since. I've heard a lot of people being in sessions like this and say the same thing. Um, and in the end, the consultants showed up with buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of Legos. But then I started thinking about the number one problem. How are blind people going to deal with Legos? Because in my limited knowledge of how people who are blind live their lives, I don't see them playing with Legos. So I called up a good friend of mine, Tony, and I said, "Hey, Tony, you're showing up to these sessions." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm showing up to these sessions." I said, "Keep in mind, you're going to be doing something uniquely different. You're going to be playing with Legos." "I'm going to be doing what?" he said. Anyways, he ended up showing up as a favor to me, and he didn't leave for the 2.5 days. He had so much fun. He playing with Legos. It was incredible. Anyways, at the end of the Lego sessions, we ended up basically coming up with, at that time, was 8 pillars, 9 pillars, and the meat to the potatoes to what those pillars should look like. And the act that we now know was built and designed at a very rudimentary key point by federal public servants with disabilities for individuals with disabilities. This makes this piece of legislation incredibly unique.
Yeah, it sounds like not only the process unique, but the output then, because of the unique kind of impetus and the participation, all kind of coalesce together.
Yeah. And it is really funny because there were several people who were blind, several people who were deaf, and they were communicating via Legos. It was just something to be seen.
As you mentioned, you obviously, thought about kind of the structure of this book, and you can see it in kind of like two acts, and one is, historical, and one is pointing forward. How important was it to you that like this, like, I mean, even the book title suggests that this is just where this is a jumping off point. This is not a closed story.
That's right. One of the things, like I go back to what I was saying, we had 4.5 years to build this. So to use Minister Cultro saying, all we wanted to do was build a piece of legislation that would give the power back to the individuals with disabilities. So that would give the power for them to take on an issue and run with it. And pretty much that's what I wanted. Like, there was 2 reasons for the book. The number one reason for the book is I wanted to do a historical write-up about, what the act's about, really explain the act. But the second thing was I wanted people with disabilities in this country and our allies to really understand how much power they really have in their hands to advocate on behalf of accessibility issues if they pop up. And there is an immense amount of power here, Michael, but we're not seeing it being utilized properly.
That power, I think, in part is due to numbers. As you point out, I think it's 27% of people now in Canada identify as having a disability.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. So we're over, a quarter of the population. That is a very significant number in this country. So
It is.
It does beg the question in terms of, now having a tool like this and that many workers who can use that tool. Are you hopeful about kind of how things will go in utilizing the act, or is there, still that underlying issue of money and that is often the like barrier for things.
Well, you bring up something here. All this work was done about 9 years ago, right? The act has been in place now for 7 years, and we've had now a change of government. And what's really disappointing is that the new government doesn't even have a minister with, a subtitle of being responsible for persons with disabilities. So we've taken a massive step back, in my opinion. And my opinion is that the act, people are still working on the act, people are still doing stuff about the act, but a lot of the steam has been taken out of it, if that makes any sense.
So is that the carrot or the stick that you think is lagging? Like, has the carrot wilted, or is the stick bent a little?
I would say that the stick is bent.
Sure.
I'm hoping to use this book to hopefully, educate some of those folks about, I understand the country is in a dilemma because of our cousins to the south of us, but at the same time, you still got to recognize that our country is made up of various pockets of individuals, indigenous folks, racialized folks, east, west, north, south. You get where I'm coming from,
Mm-hmm.
right? And 27%, you would think that 27% would always guarantee us a seat at the table, but clearly not.
The book came out in May. Has it generated any feedback from either people in the disability community or from the government so far?
Well, I'm from the community. I've got a ton of people who have given me rave reviews for my book. Basically, a lot of people who said that my book is basically the book for now, that this is what people should be reading to understand about where the disability movement should be going. I can tell you, if you call me a week from now, I'll be able to give you some more news. I'm about to break into the government right now. I got a very key person who read the book and said, "Oh my God, we're really in a bad place. I need to, we're going to make a statement about how we should, acknowledge this book and how everybody in the government of certain senior rank should read this book." So it's about to start happening. Give me a week. I guarantee you, you're gonna see some announcements coming out quite soon.
Well, hopefully some folks in the government will be starting to read it. If you want to read The Race to the Starting Line, you can visit Max Brault, smafoundation.ca to purchase a copy. Max, congratulations on the release of the book, and thanks for taking some time to talk to me about it.
Yeah, one more thing, Michael. I'm going to be in the Winnipeg area around late October, early November, to do a presentation at the Museum of for Human Rights. So keep an eye out for that.